Hey everybody, welcome back. My name is Audrey. I hope you had a really great New Year's and holiday season. I'm gonna do my best of 2023 today, and in the past I've done this as a superlatives video, and I think maybe I'll use the timestamps down below to still add in some superlatives, but I'm just gonna do a traditional top 10 today, and I think I'm gonna do them in chronological order, so in the order in which I read them, although I don't know if it's a recency bias, but I do feel like the books that I read towards the end of the year were my favorites, and so the last three books that I'll mention are truly my top three for the year. There's a good 50-50 split between fiction and nonfiction in these, and I think that's pretty reflective of the reading year as a whole. I have talked about a few of these, maybe 4 or 5 of these before on this channel, but the other half are going to be new to this video, but that's okay. I know I'm not always the quickest to upload, but yeah, I hope you enjoy. I have had such a great time watching everybody's best of the year videos at the end of last year, the beginning of this year, and so I wanted to get mine out before it was too late. The first 5-star read I had last year was All Quiet on the Western Front by Erich Remarque, which is translated from the German, and this is the Germany pick for this Read the World challenge that I'm doing, and actually the very last book that I'll talk about today is another Read the World book. But this is a classic, and it's a classic about warfare. It follows a 21-year-old soldier named Paul as he enters the front lines in the trench warfare of World War I, and it follows him across a span of time. This is a story that is very much about the individual and about what the individual undergoes during war, and nothing about it is glamorous. I think maybe the most powerful thing about this book is that Paul as a character recognizes that he loses his innocence during warfare. And I think as readers and as we analyze literature, we talk a lot about loss of innocence, but I had never come across a character that talks about it within the book and kind of self-realizes what is happening. And I think I found that just incredibly heartbreaking. This is a piece of literature that I think has maybe one of the best final pages of any book that I have ever read, and I truly enjoyed my time with it. I highly recommend if you've never read All Quiet on the Western Front. I said I wasn't going to rank these, but this pick was the one that I kind of, waffled on whether I was going to include it or not, but I decided to include it in my top 10 just because it really kind of sat with me for a long time this year, and that is Cooked: A Natural Transformation by Michael Pollen. And this is maybe the third or fourth book by Michael Pollen that I have read. He writes a lot of nonfiction about food and our relationship and our interactions with food. And in this book, he looks at the chemical transformation that is cooking. And he splits this into 4 distinct sections on the traditional elements, so like earth, water, fire, air. I had to think for a minute. And so, for example, in like the fire section, he learns how to barbecue. But I think one of the things that I've realized this year that I really like in my nonfiction is when the nonfiction authors themselves are part of the storyline. So I'm not talking about a memoir. This isn't a memoir per se, but Michael Pollen takes us along as he learns about different ways that we cook our food. And so he includes a lot of his opinions and thoughts and impressions as he's, kind of going along this journey with us. I think what made this stick with me so much though is that Michael Pollen is local to where I live, and so in the section where he learns how to bake bread, he does this at this really famous bakery, and that's 20-minute walk for me. So I finished that section and I was like, you know what? Let's check out this loaf. And so I went down there and I bought a loaf, and then I ate it, and I was like, this is really good. So I feel like that kind of aspect of my reading experience really made it kind of stay with me over time. But I think this is a great option if you're interested in Michael Pollen. He's probably most famous for The Omnivore's Dilemma, but I think this is a great introduction to his work if anything about him seems intriguing. Now, 2023 was the year that I discovered Patrick Radden Keefe. Of course, I had heard of him before, but I had never read any of his books. And I think January last year, I read Empire of Pain, which I really enjoyed. And then I worked my way through, I think, the majority of his backlist. He's got 5 books total, and I read 4 of them this year. My favorite of the 4 was definitely Say Nothing. What is the subtitle on it? A True Story of Murder and Memory in Northern Ireland. And I think that, you know, there's a reason why this book is so hyped up and why it's so loved. If you really like narrative nonfiction, which to me is the story of an event or a time or historical, you know, kind of era through the experiences of individuals. If you like that kind of narrative nonfiction storytelling, then, you know, there's a reason why he's so popular. I found this to be a really richly layered story. So on the surface, it's about the disappearance of a Belfast mother in the early kind of 1970s. But what it really is about the Provisional Irish Republican Army, and in particular, how they used violence to push a certain political kind of idea. And Patrick Radden Keefe really touches upon the idea that over time and with kind of the benefit of memory, the way that we use to validate certain actions becomes different and sometimes challenged through distance. And I think that this kind of idea of, you know, challenging and re-examining the ways in which we validate the actions that we take was a really interesting twist on this. If you don't know anything about the Troubles, it's like me walking into this. It was a little bit slow to begin with, but once I hit a certain kind of understanding of the landscape and the players, I really couldn't put this book down. So those first 3 books actually take us all the way through the first half of the year, so it's definitely weighted towards the second half of the year. But in early July, I went on a hiking trip with my cousins to Alberta in Canada, and our days were very full and we were very tired at the end of the day, and yet I still stayed up until 4:30 in the morning one night because I just absolutely love this book. And this is my favorite romantasy book of the year, and it is Serpents on the Wings of Night, Serpents and the titles. The Serpent and the Wings of Night by Carissa Broadbent. And, you know, this is a story, all you, I think, really need to know is that it has vampires, it has, like, reluctant allies to lovers, and there is an element of Hunger Games to it. But I felt like out of all the romantasy that I read this year, which was, you know, a fair amount, this was the book where I cared the most about both the characters and the plot, and typically I only care about the characters getting together. So I feel like, yeah, this one was one that I truly enjoyed. Carissa Broadbent is coming out, I think, with multiple duologies in this world. You know, this has a second book off of it, which I also read, but I think each of the duologies follows a different kind of romantic pairing. So I eagerly anticipate the next release in this series. This is by far my favorite kind of fantasy romance read of the year. And that includes Fourth Wing. I read Fourth Wing and I liked it, but this one I thought blew it out of the water. Making a very hard turn in subject, we have All the Beauty in the World, The Metropolitan Museum of Art and Me by Patrick Bringley, which is the only memoir that I have on the list today. And it was a surprise 5-star read for me. I guess I just wasn't expecting to like it as much as I did. Patrick Bringley was 25 when he lost his brother unexpectedly. And in the midst of all of this kind of loss, he decides to sign up to be a guard at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And this covers, you know, his experiences across 10 years within that service. And, you know, it is very much about art. And so Patrick Bringley talks a lot about the different pieces of art and the history of different pieces of art that he loves and that resonate with him. But I think what this is truly about is about how the world can keep on moving when you are kind of rooted in place by loss and by grief. And I think the most powerful thing that I found in this book was how much beauty the author found in routine and in the mundane. And so this was a really intimate read and very emotional. It's very slow also. I think it definitely isn't for everybody, but I feel like it pulled at certain heartstrings that I didn't know that I had. And it was the one book this year that did make me cry. So If any of that kind of sounds appealing, then I highly recommend picking this up. I did read it in audio and the author narrates it himself, so I would recommend it in that kind of format. You Again by Kate Goldbeck was my favorite contemporary romance of the year. And I think that I mentioned this in like an anticipated books video like a year ago. And I think what I mentioned about what caught my eye is the fact that in the blurb, we learn that the two main characters of this book meet because they are both dating the same woman. And I just thought that that was a really great kind of introduction to a romance book. I think that this book would work well for somebody who likes kind of traditional commercial contemporary romance, which I myself also enjoy, but you also like books, I'm gonna use the phrase, about millennial love, like messy millennial love. So something like Sally Rooney, maybe. I think if you like both those types of books, this is a good kind of mashup of those types of genres. I actually spent a lot of time last night reading the negative reviews on this, because out of all the books I'm mentioning today, this one has kind of the worst reviews. I think a lot of people just didn't like the messiness of the main character, but I don't know. I just felt like she could have been someone that I knew in real life. This is very much a retelling of When Harry Met Sally, but I think a little grittier, you know, a 2020 version of it, maybe something that HBO would produce. And I just had such a great time with it. So You Again was by far my favorite contemporary romance of the year. Art and art history was a subject that I really enjoyed this year, so I'm bouncing back to the subject of art again for Caravaggio, A Life Sacred and Profane by Andrew Graham-Dixon, which has such a good subtitle. That is such a good subtitle, A Life Sacred and Profane. And I think, you know, if you don't like Caravaggio as an artist, it's maybe not the book for you. But if you have seen his work or are interested in his work, then this is an absolutely fantastic biography, and I just had such a great time with this book. There are two things that stand out to me the most about this biography. First is that Andrew Graham-Dixon tells not only the history of this Italian artist, he lived in I think the late 1500s to early 1600s. He tells us not only about Caravaggio's life and times, but also what was the world like during this kind of, you know, period of history. So what were the politics, the religious history, the artistic environment that made Caravaggio so unique to the time in which he painted. So this is not an analysis of how we think about Caravaggio's works as people in the 21st century, but it is an analysis of how Caravaggio's works were revolutionary in the time period in which they were made. So that's the first thing that I really like about it, because it's half a history of the Renaissance and half a history of Caravaggio, the man. The second thing that I really like about it is I love how Andrew Graham-Dixon talked about his primary sources. You are only as good as the data that you collect. Firm believer in this. And I just thought it was fantastic how he engaged the reader in how he used primary sources. And so there are like 3 or 4 primary sources for finding out what was, you know, happening in Caravaggio's life. One of those is like, you know, a competitor of Caravaggio. And so the author really dives into what you can glean from not only what that biographer said, but also what he didn't say. And I really love that aspect of it. I thought that, you know, I listened to this as an audiobook and the narrator's really good, but I was constantly like looking up paintings left and right. And so I think this is definitely worth reading in print, but I had a great time with it. It's also pushed me to pick up more kind of chunky artist biographies. So I think I have one on Leonardo, I have one on Van Gogh, I think I have one on Monet, and I think it's going to be a great theme for this year. Okay, we've reached the top 3, and so these are my favorite 3 books of the year. And my favorite fiction book of the year is Trust by Hernan Diaz. And this is a book that is best approached not knowing anything. So I'm actually going to be the most vague with this one. But this is a piece of historical fiction that really looks at the intersection of power and perception. And it's this very richly layered and kind of intimate story. You can tell that it was very carefully crafted. I think that if you really liked Piranesi by Susanna Clarke, you might like this book. not because the plots are anything alike, but because when I read Piranesi, I started the book very confused and not understanding what was happening, and just really being like, I'm so lost. And slowly, all of the threads started to overlap, and I felt exactly the same reading Trust. It was a little bit of a slow start, and then once I hit like a third of the book, I absolutely could not put this down. I actually finished this on a flight, or I wanted to finish on a flight, and I wish that the flight was longer so that I could have finished it. So I got off the plane and I sat in baggage claim and I finished the rest of the book. But I just think that this was a truly beautifully crafted novel, and I think it deserves all of the accolades that it got this year. And so if Trust has ever intrigued you, or if you really like Piranesi, I think this is one worth checking out. For my favorite nonfiction, we have Ghosts of the Tsunami, Death and Life in Japan's Disaster Zone by Richard Lloyd Parry. And I would say, first of all, trigger warning for this being really sad. And it's about death, and in particular the death of children. But I thought this was masterfully written. This is the story about the 2011 Japanese tsunami. And when most people think about that day, they think a lot about the Fukushima nuclear disaster, and that was how I also felt before picking up this book. But the vast majority of deaths that occurred that day, so over 18,000 deaths that occurred that day, was because of the tsunami itself and the waves that hit Japan's shore. And in particular, this author kind of dives deep into the events in this certain kind of prefecture, and specifically a school in which 70 of the 74 children that were present at the time of the tsunami ended up dying. And this is pretty kind of rare or surprising, I guess, because Japan is a country that is very much prepared for earthquakes and for tsunamis. And so the author dives into what about this school and the events that happened that morning caused the deaths of so many children. But it is also a story about grief. I guess that's a theme for this year, maybe. It's a theme that really resonated with me this year. But this follows how different people, and how Japanese people in general, kind of deal with grieving and with grief. One of the things that makes this really unique, I read this actually as this is part of like a book club that I do with my dad. And so he mentioned something when we were talking about this book, that this book could only have been written by an expat. And I agree with him on that, because Richard Lloyd Parry, because he's a Westerner, he's a British author or a British journalist, but he has lived in Japan for many decades, and he now has, children and a wife and family that are Japanese. And so he deeply understands Japanese language and Japanese culture, but he also stands outside of it as a Westerner. And I think the way that he pulls the reader through his analysis, highlighting, what are the connotations of certain words or certain words of translation? How do we think about spirituality in Japanese culture? But he explains this for a Western audience. I just felt like the window in which he explained the events of that day and that tsunami were incredibly unique and a very unique experience, especially for a Western audience. I would love to hear what somebody of, Japanese descent thinks about this book. So if you have read it, or just in general, if you've read it and you enjoyed it, let me know. Even if you didn't enjoy it, actually. If you've read it, let me know. But I thought this was a truly stunning, story of grief and of loss, and very compassionately told. So yeah, I was really blown away by this one. Ghosts of Tsunami was my favorite nonfiction book of 2023. And then the last book that I want to mention today is A History of Loneliness by John Boyne, which I was debating between this one and Trust for Best Fiction Book of the Year. But this is another Read the World Challenge, so it's for Ireland. And it's a piece of historical fiction. So it follows the life of a man named Odrin Yates, and Odrin enters the Catholic Church pretty early in his teens, and it follows his experiences over many years. So it jumps kind of back and forth in time. And I think, Odrin Yates as a character is so different from me. Absolutely different in the way that we approach life and in our experiences. And yet I felt like I deeply understood him as a character. And I think that just goes to say how brilliant of a writer John Boyne is. And so a lot of this book touches upon kind of the subject of sexual abuse of children within the Catholic Church. But what it really is like a searing condemnation of how complacency hurts people and how one can perpetrate injustice through inaction. I found it just very heart-wrenching. It was also, I listened to it in audiobook. Actually, I listened to most of these books as audiobooks. And maybe it was the accent of the narrator, but it felt totally immersive. This is my first book by John Boyne, but it will absolutely not be my last. And yeah, those were my top 10 books of 2023. I feel like overall I had a pretty good reading year. I read fewer books than previous years, but I think more of the books I read I enjoyed. In general, I read, longer books this year than other years. So yeah, again, I've had such a great time watching other people's best of 2023 videos. But if you don't have a channel, then I would love to know what your favorite book of 2023 was. But yeah, I hope y'all are doing well. Take care, and I'll see you soon. Bye.